Hello everyone and welcome back. We have reached the seventh circle and we are in the last of the 3 rings of that seventh circle. If you're not using your map in the back of your edition or somewhere in the edition that you own, I suggest you start doing so. It'll help you keep track of how far we've come and how far we have yet to go. Remember, in the seventh circle, we are dealing with the violent in 3 rings: the violent against others, the violent against themselves, and the violent against God. How can you be violent against God, you may rightfully ask? And Dante answers in several ways, one of which we'll see here, which is you violate the order of things as it's embodied in nature. That's one of the ways Dante suggests that you can be violent against God. In Inferno 15, we meet the sodomites. Now, the medieval conception of sodomy, or homosexuality, classifies it as sinful because it doesn't heed the divinely ordained commandment to be fruitful and multiply. So it is not a sin of excess or of desire or passion, as we encountered above with incontinence. Rather, it's an offense against, as Dante puts it here, the order of things, against regeneration, against the process of creation. But in fact, Dante doesn't really say that at all here. He gives us very little to go on about sodomy to begin with, so much so that scholars have argued exactly what he means by sodomy in these cantos. What's important to remark, although it doesn't exculpate Dante for putting homosexuals in hell, is that Dante doesn't follow a particularly common treatment of sodomy or homosexuality, which focused on its carnality and upon it as a sexual perversion. None of that is present in these cantos. In fact, Dante puts homosexuals in purgatory as well. Now remember, there are 2 classes of people in Dante's afterlife. There are the damned and there are the saved, because everyone on the purgatorial mountain will eventually make it to heaven, which means that the implication is that there are homosexuals in heaven. That may seem entirely reasonable to you and me and entirely mundane, but it certainly was not so in the Christian Middle Ages. In fact, it's a dramatic departure from conventional teaching and preaching. So should we look askance on Dante's view of homosexuality? Of course we should, but should we also at the same time recognize a definite progressiveness in his treatment of this sin? I think absolutely. Soon after Virgil and the pilgrim enter this circle, one of the shades tugs on the hem of Dante's garment and is surprised to see him here, as much as the pilgrim, when he recognizes who it is surprised to see the sinner. His name is Brunetto Latini, and he was one of the most distinguished figures of Florentine culture. Certainly a model for Dante, perhaps even a teacher, at least a mentor, though scholars say it's not entirely clear. He was a notary and a chancellor of the first popular government, that is the primo popolo, about which we'll talk more later. He was a philosopher, a teacher of rhetoric, and was driven into exile, as so many were during the years of Dante's lifetime and just before. He's surprised to see the pilgrim here, because the pilgrim's not dead. The pilgrim is utterly surprised to see him here because Brunetto was a man of such fine and upstanding worth in the world. So this is another sympathetic and moving portrait of someone whom Dante the poet and the pilgrim obviously hold in high regard. The language here involves paternal care and mentoring. And as in Inferno 5, when the storm that whipped around the lustful seemed to calm itself just enough for Paolo and Francesca to speak with the pilgrim, so too here the great punishment of the tormenting flames falling from the air onto the burning sands at these sinners' feet. It scorches and disfigures them. That seems to stop momentarily, long enough that Dante may have this intimate and paternal conversation. Brunetto died when Dante was a young adult, after he had already written some of his verse and some of his works, so he knew, Dante clearly knew about him, and you'll notice in this passage that he places great confidence in Dante and in Dante's potential. Dante says, in tribute to Brunetto, that he taught Dante how man eternalizes himself. That's a neologism, a word that Dante coins, eternalizes himself. And he means by achieving literary fame and glory. This line is particularly provocative. On the one hand, clearly Dante did believe in literary fame and in the way that it brings you a kind of eternity. Your name indeed lives on after your death. But of course, we're in the Christian afterlife here. So we've got to ask, is this the right kind of eternity? Is this the only kind of eternity? Dante is going to learn through his journey that there are indeed other ways of eternalizing oneself that don't involve individual achievement and accomplishment. However, the poet knows, because he's writing the poem, that this is a work of individual achievement and accomplishment, and that, in fact, it is going to, as he suspects, make him as eternal as he can be. So once again, we encounter a divide between what the pilgrim expresses and what the poet may or may not intend. We can say, alas, that it's not a lesson that Brunetto himself learned. We likely wouldn't know about Brunetto's work if it weren't for Dante, and certainly within the fiction of the poem, Brunetto has not eternalized himself as he might have hoped on earth. The shades in Cantos 15 and 16 are all Florentines of some significant renown, so it does prompt us to ask questions about the language that Dante uses regarding fruitlessness and sterility, and how those tropes, which seem to be connected with sodomy, are also connected, however, with the political turbulence about which we've spoken. In Canto 15, at line 61, he calls the Florentines a malicious, ungrateful people that came down in ancient times from Fiesole. Fiesole is the small hill town above Florence. It was believed that the original inhabitants of Florence came from there. And Latini offers yet another prophecy of Dante's exile, and he advises him how to conduct himself. He says, "Be sure to cleanse yourself of their foul ways." You'll want to read the final line in Canto 15 about it being unclear whether Brunetto was indeed the winner or the loser, and you'll want to decide for yourself exactly how you think that line should be interpreted. We encounter similar denunciations in Canto 16. In a particularly famous passage, the pilgrim says that, quote, "newcomers from the city and its quick gains have brought excess and arrogance." That is, Dante suggests that the influx of merchants and the sudden great wealth of the new inhabitants of the city brought with it money, greed, excess, and treachery. This is a particularly Franciscan point of view. That is, we will talk later about the Franciscans, the mendicant religious order who viewed wealth in particular as a great cause of man's sinfulness and plight. It's fairly clear that Dante studied with the Franciscans. He knows very much about the Franciscan order, and some scholars even suggest that he may have joined the Franciscans as a layperson for a period. One last point about Canto 16, and that is the group of sinners whom we meet here are overtly sexualized. That is, they are portrayed as naked, they are compared to naked, oiled wrestlers, and they are grappling together, their bodies kind of intertwined. So it's a much more explicitly sexualized and erotic image than we had back with Brunetto. And in a remarkable passage, Dante says explicitly that if it weren't for fear of the fire, the flame that falls from the air and burns them, quote, "I should have thrown myself down there." The final figure whom we meet in these three cantos isn't a sinner at all, but another overseer of hell, another guardian, like Minos, like Cerberus, only this time the great beast Geryon isn't a guardian who's going to keep us out, but an instrument who is going to lower Dante and Virgil into the depths of the fraudulent circles. Time is running short, so I'll just share with you two observations about this magnificent beast to whom really the entire canto is devoted. First, he is the embodiment of fraud, which is the governing sin of these last two circles. And remember, fraud is specifically the act of deceit and almost always involves some form of language. And second, Dante cannot avoid him. There's no stairwell, there's no elevator, there's no other way down. Virgil tells him, this is how we must descend into this great chasm with a roaring waterfall. In terms of the plot, he must simply use hell's inhabitants to get around, just as several cantos ago he rode across the river of blood on the back of one of the centaurs. In terms of the narrative, though, and what Dante's trying to convey about his craft as a poet, how he writes and what he's aiming at, what can we observe here? Well, this may be Dante's admission that he must use the very instruments of fraud in order to complete his journey, that is, in order to write the poem. It might not be too far to say that Geryon is the poem itself, that Dante recognizes that the outrageous, wild fictions that he is assembling are very close to the fictions that the fraudulent will use to deceive one another. And in fact, in this very canto, he will turn and address the reader in what's called an apostrophe, and he will swear that he is telling the truth, as if he knows that in this very moment, it's his greatest lie. It's his most outrageous fiction yet, a wild flying beast upon whom he must descend. And he feels the danger of the gambit. On the way down, Virgil sits on Geryon between Dante and the scorpion-like tail so that it doesn't sting him. And the pilgrim thinks of Icarus. He thinks of Icarus who flew too close to the sun with his waxen wings, who pushed too far the limits of his art, and who fell to his death because of it. The pilgrim fears dying, falling to his death in lower hell. What does the poet fear? Is he asking, in the midst of practicing his craft, whether he's gone too far? Have I, he seems to ask, like Icarus, presumed too much in crafting this vast, intricate, compelling, will I be punished for it, and will I fall with my own poem? I can sense, even through this screen, that you're now loving Dante, that you're beginning to understand just how compelling and gripping is each canto, and just how complicated these encounters can become once we begin to pull back the layers just a little bit. And up next for us, popes.